Thank you so much, Dr. Zepeda, for being my advisor and for dealing with the consequences of my choosing Ockham. Thank you, Dr. Papadopoulos, for all of your very helpful comments on my thesis. I appreciated it. And thank you, Dr. Shields, for, I think, being on every panel today. Thank you for being here. Before we begin, let's pray. This is the prayer to St. Thomas Aquinas. In the name of Father, Son, Holy Spirit, Amen. Angel of schools, at the bidding of Peter, thousands today are saluting thee thus. We too are claiming thy care and thy counsel. Angel of schools, be an angel to us. Come to our aid when thou hearest us calling. Light up the dark, make the rough places plain. Bring to our thoughts the unknown or forgotten. Give us the words that we seek for in vain. St. Thomas Aquinas, Our Lady, Seat of Wisdom. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. You are in the Garden of Eden. Eve has just been approached by the serpent, who asks her, "Did God really tell you to not eat of the fruit?" And she says, "We can eat of the fruit of any tree in this garden, except for the tree of the knowledge of good and evil." The serpent cunningly replies, "God didn't tell you this because he doesn't want you to die. He told you this because he doesn't want you to be godlike. He doesn't want you to gain the knowledge and to become more free." Eve, seeing that the fruit looked good to taste, took the fruit, also to gain knowledge of good. The question I want to pursue today is, was the serpent right that to be able to choose good or evil is the most free choice? Does the free man do whatever he wants? I will be addressing this question through following Ockham, William of Ockham, and St. Thomas Aquinas' views of free will. First, we will see that Ockham believes in the freedom of indifference, the uninhibited ability to choose whatever he likes. And then St. Thomas Aquinas', which, if you were taught, as I was when I was little, that freedom is to do whatever you want, St. Thomas Aquinas is the man for you. So first of all, going into William of Ockham, I will first determine what free will is according to him, then the will's relation to other faculties, and finally the implications of his view. And I will go through this same set for St. Thomas Aquinas. So first of all, what is free will according to William of Ockham? He says that freedom is the lordship over one's own acts. He says that it is an indifference of choice which is contingent on your will. Indifference, he says, is the choice between contraries. Yes or no, I will, I won't, for or against, etc. He clarifies, though, that these choices must occur in succession. They cannot occur simultaneously because of the principle of non-contradiction. So you cannot will for a cookie and will against a cookie in the same moment. However, he says that because the choice is contingent, it does not rely on anything external, or it should not rely on anything external to the will. The first quote you have is, quote, "Contingency is taken for a thing that produces some effect, and that without any change on its part, or on the part of anything else, that thing has it within its power to not produce as well as to produce, so that from the thing's nature it is determined neither to produce nor to not produce." What this is saying is that there can be nothing external, not just to you for your choice to be made, but external to your will for your choice to be made. So a truly contingent decision would be one in which you are indifferent to both decisions, but also there's nothing within you that is pushing you one way or the other besides the will. Now, this seems at first like that's how we typically define freedom, but let's see how he relates it to the other faculties. In my second point, the will's relation to other faculties. The intellect, he says, is the same substance as the will, but it has a different act. So they're both part of the same soul, but the intellect has the act of understanding, and as he puts it very helpfully, the will has the act of willing or desiring. So, however, he says that the will directs the intellect, We see this all the time where someone gives you new information and you say, I'm going to leave that to the side. Or they give you information and you say, I really want that information. I'm going to take that to heart. So the will can direct the intellect based on what it wants to take into consideration. He says, on the other hand, that the will can will anything the intellect can represent. So the intellect also directs the will in a way. He brings in beatitude to say that based on the intellect, the will can even will contrary to beatitude. And he says it can do this by believing either that beatitude is impossible for him to achieve, or by believing that in beatitude he would receive no rest, no comfort, no happiness, and then he could will against beatitude. So in this way, it seems almost like there's an infinite regress of the will directing the intellect, but then the intellect moving the will. He says, in opposition to this, however, the second quote, whatever the intellect can dictate should be willed against, can be willed against by the will. The will is not necessarily conformed to the judgment of reason elsewhere. Nevertheless, it can be conformed to the judgment of reason, whether that judgment is right or erroneous. So while the will does direct the intellect and the will can move the intellect can move the will has the final say. It is the first principle. It is the actual mover that moves itself. He talks about the relationship of the intellect to the will, as well as the senses to the will, or habits, which are an intellectual act, to the will, as partial causes. So each faculty is a partial cause. A partial cause, he says, is when one creature or power concurs with another in order to cause something. Now, this seems pretty intuitive, but once you apply it to specifically free will, it becomes more interesting. He says that if there's a combination of many partial causes, the choice becomes conditionally necessary instead of contingent, so it becomes less free. So if over here we have the least free action, it's just not free at all. In the middle, we have a semi-free action. It's kind of free, but not as free as it could be. And over here, we have the most free action. We've already talked about the contingent action, in which the will decides based on no external influences to itself. That is the contingent action, the most free action. Then we have the semi-free action. And this is what he's talking about with partial causes. As soon as partial causes weigh into your decision, you become less free. Because at that point, your will is not able to choose indifferently, but is rather veering towards one side. In quote 3, he says, just as one partial cause is impeded merely by the non-assistance of another partial cause, so sometimes one partial cause causes necessarily with another partial cause, assisting it. Yet it does so with conditional necessity. Namely, it causes necessarily so long as it does not will to destroy the other concurring cause. And sometimes when that second partial cause is removed, the first partial cause causes contingently. I'm sorry for dragging you into that. An example of this would be if someone doesn't actually care about their health, and they also don't believe that bitter medicine would achieve health for themselves, and yet they were still to choose to take the bitter medicine. That would be a truly contingent choice, because their intellect is not directing them towards it. Their will is not, senses is not directing them towards it. Instead, it is solely an act of the will. That is the most free choice. He says in quote 4, however, when an efficacious willing for health and the intellect's firm belief that health cannot be acquired in any other way are both posited, then the will does not will for the bitter medicine in an unqualifiedly contingent way. Instead, it wills for the medicine necessarily, with a kind of necessity such that it is not able to not will for the medicine unless it wills to destroy either the efficacious willing for health or that belief of the intellect. What he is saying here is that the conditionally necessary choice is when those partial causes are directing the will. However, it is only a partial cause. It is only conditionally necessary because the will still has the option to not take one of those partial causes into account. However, as soon as the will does take those partial causes into account, it becomes a conditionally necessary choice, a less free choice. It's important to clarify that for Ockham, this is not a decision that is completely devoid of freedom. It is just less free. The least free choice, would be that in which it is completely necessary. It is completely determined. You are coerced into it by other causes. So with the relationship between each faculty and the will in mind, it is also, contingent choices are more free than those that are conditionally necessary. But external action requires a partial cause and a principle. So when we actually see it in reality, most of the time we see semi-free actions. We don't actually see just contingent actions of someone. I don't know if you've seen those videos of people saying, when you remember you have free will, and then they just do something like don't press the button to cross the crosswalk, things like that. We don't typically see people doing things for absolutely no reason. And Ockham acknowledges this. What are the implications of this definition of freedom, though? Is this right? Is it just the ability to do whatever you want, devoid of your intellect, of your habits, of your sensibilities? I think the main problem with Ockham that I have found is that he believes that nature inhibits freedom. Nature inhibits freedom. He believes that in order to be a truly free man, you cannot act as a true human would in all of your human abilities and faculties and powers. Instead, you have to let go of part of yourself, your intellect or your senses or whatever it is, in order to just choose spontaneously in the moment. This does have some repercussions just naturally because all choices are reduced to spontaneous decisions, or at least all free choices. There is no progress. You can't make one decision to play the piano and then the next day make the same decision and then do that for 5 years and become an expert at piano, or I guess 13 years. Instead, you are limited to one choice in the present moment. What does your will desire? Now, if any of you have practiced piano, I'm sure that each of those times you practice, you did not actually will to practice. Instead, you had to override your will or inform your will with your intellect and lean into that partial cause, as Ockham puts it. So, according to Ockham, your rational decisions are not inherently good. He does recognize also, though, that moral actions, as of now, require your reason. So he believes in divine command theory, in which ethics only occurs because of what God wills right now. And that if he were to will something different at another point, then that would become the new source of ethics. He believes this to such an extent that he says, once you arrive in beatitude, so you've seen the pearly gates, you're in heaven, you've made it, then God could will for you to not feel beatific enjoyment. He also believes that God could will for you to no longer love him, even in beatitude. Just by the fact that God's will overrides everything else. It overrides our nature of having a specific end and of, when that end is achieved, having complete happiness. So with these implications of Ockham, hopefully you're starting to second guess the idea of just freedom is the ability to do whatever you want. But is there an actual alternative? I want to now transition to St. Thomas Aquinas' view of free will. He says that freedom is a cause unto itself, that what is a cause unto itself is precisely what we call free. He calls free will he defines it as one power with two faculties. So very similar to Ockham in that there's one substance, but two acts. In quote 6, he says, "The root of liberty is the will as the subject thereof, but it is the reason as its cause. For the will can tend freely towards various objects, precisely because the reason can have various perceptions of good. Hence, philosophers define the free will as being a free judgment arising from reason, implying that reason is the root of liberty. When free will is treated as this interaction between the intellect and the will, then we see that it also directs the will. The will does not just act freely as a principal mover. Instead, the intellect is in some way on par with the will. He clarifies that the will has freedom of exercise and freedom of specification for contrary options. So he is not totally opposite William of Ockham. Freedom of exercise is the ability to say, I will do X or I won't do X. It's just the decision to act or not to act. Then there is freedom of specification, which is, I've already decided to act, now what am I going to do? And Aquinas says that all of these ways of judgment incorporate with each other to reach a means to an end. So they determine, all right, this is the end, and this is how I'm going to get to it. For Aquinas, where he mainly differs from Ockham is that he says, we cannot choose our end, though. We cannot choose what our will and our intellect are going to be geared towards. The intellect and the will, he says, were designed for universal truth and goodness. So we can decide the means to the end. We can choose between different goods, but we cannot choose whether to pursue good or not. This necessity, he says, does not contradict freedom because it derives from and works with man's very nature. So it's not someone strong-arming us into, you're going to try to seek your good. Instead, it's just something that flows from our nature. All of us want something that is good for ourselves. In quote 7, it says, what befits a thing naturally and immovably must be the root and principle of all else appertaining thereto, since the nature of a thing is the first in everything, and every movement arises from something immovable. So this necessity of end, as he puts it, is compatible with freedom. God is the source, and he is the end, but we are not being strong-armed into it. It flows from our nature. How does the will relate to the other faculties? Let's move on to the second point. Aquinas says that acting and desiring without judgment is what brute animals do, and he does not condone it. Instead, he says man's freedom stems from his ability to act according to his free judgment and to synthesize all of the information he gains from other faculties. The intellect has free judgment. This is primarily where he says we are able to achieve freedom. And why we have freedom? Because having different reasons, having different ways of reaching goods and of thinking about goods, then we can come to different conclusions about the best means to the end of happiness. Quote 8 has Aquinas saying, the intellect perceives the end, the means leading to the end, and the bearing of one on the other. But the appetite of an intellectual substance is not tied down by any one definite good, for it follows intellectual apprehension, which embraces good universally. Therefore, the appetite of an intelligent substance is free as having a common stance toward any given good. So this is the first way in which we have free judgment, that we can look at one good, look at another good, and then we can decide which one we want. There is no straight evil in the world or straight good in the world. Everything kind of has a little bit of blend of both. So we can actually choose between everything on earth. The only thing that is actually fixed, he says, is beatitude, because at that point we have the universal good, our will and our intellect are both satisfied. Quote number 9 has the other means of free judgment. He says, man acts from judgment because by his apprehensive power, he judges that something should be avoided or sought. But because this judgment, in the case of some particular act, is not from a natural instinct, but from some act of comparison in the reason, therefore he acts from free judgment and retains the power of being inclined to various things. For reason in contingent matters may follow opposite courses, as we see in dialectic syllogisms and rhetorical arguments. Now, particular operations are contingent, and therefore, in such matters, the judgment of reason may follow opposite courses and is not determinate to one. So we see, first of all, that there's free judgment in that you can weigh between different goods and you can determine which goods you're going to look at, but also that you can use your judgment in different ways. You can use different rhetorical devices to try to learn, or you can follow different types of syllogisms. They are not necessarily a dichotomy. It's not necessarily that there's one correct way of reasoning and one incorrect way of reasoning. There are several modes that you could take in order to find the truth. Aquinas differs from Ockham in a second way, that he says a reliance on erroneous judgment does happen in nature. We see that. But it occurs because of ignorance and because of an overriding of the intellect by the passions. It is not, he says, freedom. It is rather a perversion of freedom. I would like to refer you to the chart for quote 11. This is from Pinckaers' book, The Sources of Christian Ethics. He says that the intellect, or intelligence as he has it here, and the will interact. That you can have some knowledge in your intellect. For example, I know that food gives me nourishment. And then you can have basic willing. I want nourishment. And that those respectively correspond to reasoning and to a choice, which hopefully can be free. The reasoning, for example, would be, this is the way that I can get nourishment. It's by getting food. And then the choice, the freedom, would be, I am going to pick this food. However, if the intellect or the will, if either of those are perverted, the outcome will also be perverted. So going through that, the intelligence, that is something that we can cultivate. We can also cultivate the will. This leads to the implications of Aquinas' thought. If you remember, with Ockham, we said that that actions were reduced to spontaneous decisions. For Aquinas, it is quite the opposite. For Ockham, maybe the most free person would actually be a child who is not intelligent and who has not learned to override his will by his intellect. However, for Aquinas, he says we actually need formation. We need to progress. We need to inculcate habits in ourselves so that we can actually gain happiness. So for him, it is not a spontaneous decision, but rather allows for progress. There is continuity in our actions because we can choose one thing based on that intellect and the will interacting and the reasoning and the freedom, and then we can do that all over again and do that multiple times. And in that way, we don't become less free, but rather we are pushed towards one good. I was reading St. Francis de Sales the other day, and he had this image in which you walked outside and you were presented with two options. One was hell. One was heaven. And you had to pick between the two of them. Now, when I put myself into this situation, I was thinking, wow, that would be amazing. Because who in their right mind would ever choose hell? This is a very clear decision in which you are moved to one thing. There's nothing in you in that moment that would push you towards hell. However, this is what Ockham would say is not a free choice because you are so clearly wanting one thing. He's saying you need an indifference. You need to not care. There needs to be nothing pushing you towards one thing or the other. Whereas Aquinas says, in that instance, you are the most free because there's no way that you are choosing something that is bad for you. Instead, you are choosing what your soul truly desires. So for St. Thomas Aquinas, in response to Ockham, who said that nature inhibits freedom, he says that freedom fulfills our nature in order to lead to perfect happiness. Again, we do not act simply because we are strong-armed into it, but rather because we want to be happy, and this is the only means to happiness. Quote 12 has from Paradise Lost, says that reason in man obscured or not obeyed, immediately inordinate desires and upstart passions catch the government from reason, and to servitude reduce man, till then free. Adam and Eve did not become more free because of the fall. Instead, their intellect and their will were clouded by sin. No longer could they choose to walk freely with God in the garden, but instead we are now left with the daily decisions of, do I talk about this person or not? Do I eat those 3 extra cookies or not? Our choice is less clear, and because of that, we are less free and less able to choose what we actually want to. They did not become more free, they actually enslaved themselves. Eating of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil did not make Adam and Eve more like God. Instead, it resulted in death. It resulted in a divorce from God and a damaging of the likeness to him. So the free man does not do whatever he wants. The most free man actually is he who best employs all of his human faculties in order to most perfectly achieve his final end. As a catechism puts it, the more one does what is good, the freer one becomes. Thank you.
Okay, let's start with questions from the panel.
Okay. Thank you for oration, and it's always a delight to see somebody delving into scholastic thought. Now, Ockham has certainly, as you've shown, has a more radical sense of freedom than Aquinas. But Ockham thinks that we ought to use our freedom to do what God wills. Okay, so in saying that we have the freedom to choose heaven or hell, for happiness or against happiness, he's not saying that it's equally right to choose either, is he?
Right. No, he actually says, as you said, that we should still choose the moral choice. We should still choose what is good. However, where he differs from Aquinas is that as soon as it becomes easy, like as soon as it becomes natural for you to do what is good, you're actually less free. So even though he says you should be moral, he says in that process, you're going to become less free.
Okay. Now, maybe I'm imputing a motive to Ockham, but doesn't it seem like he's got a good motive, right? Because you want, in order to kind of impute like a merit or demerit, or to hold someone responsible, right? You want to say that they were free, they could have done it and could have not done it, right? And isn't there, in kind of exalting this freedom of the will to choose whatever, right, in any circumstances, that you don't even have to be to choose in accord with your habits, right? You could choose against the habits, at any time, right? Isn't that kind of safeguard culpability, right? And there's a worry with the freedom for perfection sense of freedom that people wouldn't be responsible for their failings, right? I see that especially at number 10. That's not from Aquinas, but from an author talking about Aquinas, right? Mm-hmm. And so it's an interpretation, right? He's saying that a failure in apprehending, a failure in comparing, resulting in a false judgment is not compatible with the will's freedom. Couldn't somebody say, well, if that's what one is thinking, when people fail to choose the good, it's not really their fault. Their passions got in the way, a wrong judgment was made. That's incompatible with freedom. So they weren't acting freely. It'd be kind of like saying, okay, I asked my 6-year-old to perform some sort of very difficult and noble act, and he fails to do it. And like, can I blame him? All right. How does one safeguard moral culpability for failings and for failure to get to heaven if one doesn't go down the freedom of indifference route?
Yeah, I think grace has a huge part to play in it. I think that with Aquinas, he says like we have this natural desire for a supernatural end. So because we have that natural desire for the supernatural end, when we choose contrary to God, we are still sinning. We are still culpable. It seems almost like he starts turning it into a type of determinism of saying like, oh, well, like you were meant to do this evil thing because you were hungry that day. Like it's just a failure and you're less free. But I think that as soon as you bring in the fact that you still know, like when he talks about ignorance, he doesn't talk about it in the sense that like Descartes does of just, oh, well, you didn't know. And so then you weren't able to do the right thing. He talks about ignorance in a sense of you kind of know, like, you know, deep down that this is bad. But you still do it because you're choosing to avert your eyes from that. And instead you're choosing to focus on this more proximate good, like a car that I'm going to steal, as opposed to the good of heaven.
Doesn't that sound like freedom of indifference? If you could have chosen to keep your mind fixed on the moral law, but you chose not to keep your mind fixed on the moral law.
What do you mean by that?
That it's not because of an intellectual failing that one sinned. It was because of a choice to have an intellectual failing that one then chose to perform the immoral deed. So it's like the choice is coming first, not the intellectual failing.
Well, right. So they interact. Both of them recognize that they interact. I think the difference is that for Ockham, he reduces it to just the will. So it wouldn't actually matter as much what the intellect thinks. Whereas Aquinas says, well, like, for example, if you don't know that it's wrong to kill, but you didn't inform your intellect, that's still your fault because they're so tightly bound. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
I think so. But is that, how is that not freedom of indifference? Like what you're describing as Aquinas' view, like freedom of indifference in regards to whether to inform one's conscience or not.
Whether to inform one's conscience or not. I think the difference is that Aquinas is saying that when you choose one good thing, that you should just, actually, I don't think I understand. What do you mean by which aspect of freedom of indifference? Are you saying just choosing between good and evil? Well, because in that respect, they don't differ. Like Aquinas also thinks you can choose bad, and that works in his definition because of his freedom of judgment, by him saying you can choose, first of all, which goods you're going to pursue, and then second of all, which modes you're going to reason. Mm-hmm. So he agrees with him in that respect.
Yeah, I guess my first question was to ask about whether the freedom of indifference means that there is an indifference with regards to what's right and wrong to do, or just that we can choose to do the right or the wrong. We're not somehow predetermined to either choose the right or the wrong. And your answer was yeah, Occam's notion of freedom of indifference is compatible with the idea that there's a right and a wrong, and that we're obligated to do the right, just that we have the freedom to not do what's right. So then my follow-up question about Aquinas is, isn't Aquinas also asserting that kind of freedom of indifference? That there's a right and a wrong, and it's up to us whether to choose to do the right or choose not to do the right?
I think the main difference lies in the reasoning behind following your will. Mm-hmm. So for Aquinas, it's because it is the good thing to do, but also because it will make you happy. So your intellect and will can kind of just move along together happily. Mm-hmm. Whereas for Ockham, you have to choose one or the other. So if your intellect says, oh, I should follow God, then your will says, well, I don't want to, but then there has to be this divorce. And if you follow your will, you're not moral. And if you follow your intellect, you're not free. So I don't think they're the same in that respect, just because they take such a different approach to ethical action.
Yeah, I wonder if that's related to, you brought in the notion of divine command theory
Mm-hmm.
as opposed, and Ockham, as opposed to a natural law theory.
Mm-hmm.
That there's a sense in which good is more arbitrary. It's just freely
Right.
decided on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is why it would be really nice to be presented with heaven and hell and choose that. But we have it more complicated than that. So I think there are aspects of Ockham that definitely seem consistent with reality.
Thank you for your oration. We've just been exploring the philosophical moral or theological moral implications of the different stances on freedom. I want to ask about implications of politics. Are there any? If I become, is it an Ockhamist? What would it be? An Ockhamian? If I took Ockham's view of freedom and the free will, does that have any necessary consequences for my political philosophy or what kind of social order I would prefer? Or is this the kind of thing that could be affirmed or denied sort of independently of those views?
I feel like Ockham is weird because, well, lots of reasons, but specifically because he says simultaneously that like we have this freedom, we are able to choose good for good and evil for evil. And that's it. Like that's what we have as our ability, our right. But then on the other hand, the result of his thinking is that law and will are incompatible, and reasoning and will are incompatible, and society versus singular people is incompatible. So,
sorry, can you say what does incompatible mean there?
as in, if someone is imposing a law on you, you cannot be free. It becomes this kind of obligatory kind of ethics because your will cannot move along with your intellect. They are combatants. So as soon as any law or rule or code is imposed on you, you are no longer free, and there's no way of you being free.
So accepting that, would Ockham recommend radical libertarianism or radical totalitarianism? In other words, like, would he privilege allowing the freedom of the subjects, or would he privilege directing them, even if it violates their freedom, to what they ought, if he cares about both things? I guess
Right.
How highly does he esteem freedom in us? Like, does that make sense?
Well, he was a Franciscan friar who was excommunicated. He ran away from Avignon with a bunch of Franciscan friars, and he wrote about how the church shouldn't have kind of a political presence. So he valued freedom for sure. I haven't actually read his political writings. He has written on them, but at least from all of this, I would imagine that he would say, have fewer laws, and that it's still good to follow the laws, but only if you are a Catholic or a Christian, and that otherwise there's nothing really forcing you to adhere to it.
Is this related to what John Paul criticizes as like the fundamental choice theory in Veritatis Splendor, that there's like what you would want, what Ockham might want is for us to make the fundamental choice for God, but then sort of add on to that antinomian, like no laws interfering with my free affirmation of the good.
Yeah, it's very similar.
Okay.
I think he brings in just the conscience more. JP2 does, but I think they're very much similarly minded.
Thank you. The they there, to be clear, was the position John Paul was arguing against in Ockham.
Yes.
Yeah,
Sorry.
In thinking about how much Ockham values freedom, can we think about how he values virtue and obeying God? How he values that compared to freedom? Can you say a little bit about that?
Yeah.
It better be virtuous and not free, or free and not virtuous.
Right.
Fit in with obeying with God's laws and his will.
Yeah. With God, he thinks that we should follow God, kind of almost blindly, that even though it is going to make you less free, that we should be moral and we should inculcate virtue in ourselves, and we should, keep having all of these partial cause weighing in on us, which is just strange because the effect is that no one is free, but he does value freedom so much that, it's kind of this contradiction in his purpose and the actual consequence.
And one other question. Ockham's also famous for being a nominalist. Can you explain how that, does that come in here? Does that affect his view, or is this why he has this view of free will?
Yeah, I think it largely does, because towards the end of his academic career, I guess you could say, he believed that no universals existed in reality, and they didn't even exist in your mind. So when someone said dog, you didn't actually think dogness. That wasn't imprinted on your mind, but instead you simultaneously in one thought of several different dogs. So if there are no universals and like no actual species or distinctions between species except for just kind of inductive reasoning, then kind of the whole idea of nature is diminished. And so, so you can say, oh, we are all human. We call us all humans because we are all very similar, but not actually that there's something inherent to us that has this same end, that has a necessary consequence.
And does that, it seems like maybe that also applies to the good as well. Or does it?
Yeah.
What do you think of the determinacy towards willing good that could be absent in his idea of will? Okay, great. Can we open this up to questions?
Dr. Geesting?
It's a terrifying thought. Let's see. So Ockham comes chronologically after Aquinas, Scotus, and the other Bonaventure, right? And so he's presumably read them, has some familiarity with their work. What motivates him to go in this direction? And then I would love to tack this on. What, according to his definition, are the created beings that are most free? I mean, is it Satan?
Yeah, right.
Who has his angelic, titanic intellect, completely able to know that the best thing for him would be to submit to God, and he chooses to do otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
And if that's not the case, how would he argue out of that?
Yeah. I think that he was trying to address the seeming determinism in Aquinas, actually, of saying, oh, we have to act according to like our intellect and our senses, and those seem like they're really pushing us towards something, and that seems like we're not as free. So at least from what I've read, that kind of seems like his starting point. In regards to your second question, so I came across these 4 worries he had, and I really had to just look over them a lot because it almost seemed like he was contradicting a lot of what he said. And one of the worries was, sin is because of indifference, but that if freedom of indifference is actually the case, then that would mean the man who sins is the most free and God and the angels are less free. And his response to the worry was, well, God and the angels are not free in respect to sin. So he kind of does say, like, man is more free because he can sin. Like, if you take his freedom of indifference to the next step, then it is saying whoever, if you can do X or Y, that's better than just being able to do Y. But at the same time, he doesn't want to say that God and the angels are less free, so he doesn't actually provide an argument for why they would be. Does that answer your question?
I think to a considerable extent, yeah.
Yeah.
There's only so much you can do with the subject, with the text you actually have.
Right, yeah. Jake.
I'm curious about what would cause Occam's free man to actually make a choice. Like, how does he determine between two different things if he's totally free when they're completely equal in his mind? It doesn't seem like there's any determining factor whatsoever between choosing anything. And I guess maybe I'm too steeped in natural law theory and Aristotelianism, but I always want to say, like, there's a reason we actually choose something. There's an end. Like, each effect has a cause. Why would Occam's free man choose between what causes that?
Yeah, and I think so. He distinguishes external actions from internal actions. Internal would be like understanding or willing, and he says that willing is the only thing that just is kind of a prime mover. That even understanding has to kind of be willed for. And then he goes further to external actions and says that those actually do require a partial cause and a principle. So I don't think he thinks that man can be truly free. Like any external action that man performs is conditionally necessary. So we don't actually see it in nature. Yeah, but yeah, I guess. Yeah, there's this non-evident capacity he presents from Scotus, in which he says, like, the non-evident capacity is you can will for and against something simultaneously. And Ockham says, no, that can't be the case. But then he says, you can will against things in succession, but not based on anything else, like any other factors except for the will. So at least in the act of willing, he doesn't really explain it except by saying that the will is somehow a first mover. Yeah. Nathan.
Thanks, Clara. Well done on your issue. I'm a little bit confused because it seems like Occam's philosophy of freedom is fundamentally flawed in some way. And what makes me think this is his idea of this freedom of indifference seems to come in conflict with God's gift of human free will. And he, from what it sounds like, he essentially concedes that in order to choose the moral thing to do, you're conceding your freedom. Or like, yeah, you're just not as free. But that also seems to be like in direct conflict with God's gift of free will. So then is he conflating this this freedom of indifference with something other than freedom? And if so, what is that?
What do you mean? Just the last part of your question? Is he equating it with a different part of freedom? What do you mean?
Conflating this freedom of indifference with something other than freedom, since that's so it's a contradiction to free will. God's gift of free will for us to choose him.
Well, yeah. So Aquinas thinks that that the rational power, because we have rational power, that is why we have free will. For Ockham, he just thinks it's just God gave us our will, and that even though it is a rational power in a sense, it doesn't rely on its being a rational power to exercise its will. So I guess he doesn't think of them as contradictory. So he doesn't actually present like a different, he only defines freedom as like this contingency of like just your will being able to act. I don't know if that answered your question. Okay. Sophie.
Maybe a follow-up to that.
Mm-hmm.
So if in following God's will or following the good we become less free, then how does Ockham view free will? Like, does he view it as something does he view it as a gift from God? We're supposed to go against it? Or does he view it as like something in us, in humans that we go against in following God? Like, because I think maybe Nathan's going to conflict
That makes sense.
between free will and the fact that in following God we seem to become less free by Ockham's theory. It's just how does he view
Right.
free will?
Yeah, he simultaneously loves freedom and also says we shouldn't follow it. Yeah, I wish I had more to say on that, but it really just anytime you try to go farther down one road, he says the opposite thing and you have to go right back the other way. That's why, like with your question as well, it's like, well, in a sense, he wants to be libertarian, but like in another sense, he says, no, it should be like not a theocracy, but maybe like a monarchy or something, or aristocracy. So, Tom.
Does he explain how the will is capable of willing? In the sense that if he doesn't think the will is a come by means, that then how can he say it's the prime mover?
Yeah, I was looking over a text the other day with you actually, and I couldn't make sense of it. Just being honest. He said that like in the physics, this was one of his worries. In the physics, according to Aristotle, then nothing can move itself. And then he says, but this doesn't count as one of the things that Aristotle says cannot be moved, because it is something like an essential potency of like heavy and light, in which it just once something is removed, it acts in a certain way. And so it doesn't need to actually be moved. Something just needs to be removed. But that's as far as I could understand. Yeah, just that it's not like a natural active principle that requires a mover. John.
So I think I actually have a question about your thesis, not Ockham. At one point you presented as kind of like the epitome of the free choice. This clear scenario where you have heaven on one side, hell on the other side. And like, there's no way you're choosing hell. And that's, you're entirely drawn to heaven. And with Aquinas, and I think your thought, that's when you're most free. So my question is, why wasn't that the situation of the garden? Like, why didn't God, if he wanted to create a free being, wanted Adam and Eve's good, why didn't he give them that kind of setup? Why was there this need to be, obscurity, some sort of subtlety in the garden? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think there are two ways in which Aquinas talks about freedom. The first is like the heaven-hell example, where it's just super clear. But the other is that he says we need to cultivate our intellect and our will, and that our choices are going to change over time, and we have to make those choices. When I was little, I would like pray that I was a puppet to God, because I would be like, I don't want to make any more decisions. And that's not what God wants for us. He wants us to make like each of those little decisions that then lead to either something beautiful or something ugly, depending on each of those small things. Sorry.
So is that saying that God wants us to have like a little bit of freedom of indifference?
I don't think so, because I think freedom of indifference kind of hinges on this this claim that nature inhibits freedom. And so I think Aquinas does think that we need to have the ability to choose the means to the end, and God wanted that too. That's why he made us rational, so we can compare and judge things, as opposed to just like natural instincts, like the brute animals. So I think it's still different from freedom of indifference, because we can choose the means to our end, but Aquinas still doesn't think we can just like choose against good for itself. Casey.
Thank you for your question. So going back right to this extreme example of heaven and hell, and you're saying, and Aquinas is saying that the most free thing to do is to choose heaven. I guess my first question then is, what does that mean to choose hell? Right, that's the most unfree choice. And then maybe again in just like a less extreme example, right? I'm having a hard time understanding, what does that mean to not choose the free thing? If that makes any sense.
Yeah. I think a big part of it is like our concupiscence. So when you choose something that is not actually good for you, like let's say I want to eat a whole cake for breakfast, there's a lot of clouding that needs to go on in your intellect for that to happen. So you can't just say, oh, I know this, like with my whole being and I'm moving towards it. Instead, you have to like put up these blocks of, oh, I'm not going to think about how I'm going to feel in 30 minutes. And like, I'm not going to think of how this is going to affect my soul with all of the gluttony and everything. So it's less free in that you actually have to separate yourself from reality, and you have to kind of build up an illusion for yourself in order to be okay with yourself. Yeah, so it's actually less free in that sense.
So you would say it's an act of, it's not an act of freedom, I guess it's an act of changing yourself?
Yeah, it's using the freedom that you have and then perverting it in a very Aristotelian manner. Yeah, so I don't think Aquinas actually, well, he probably has a word for it besides vice, but basically like the enslavement of like sin and penalty is another way that I've seen it put. Yeah. Hope.
Going off of Casey's question, can you relate what you just said to what JP2 says in Veritatis Splendor with the relationship between freedom and truth?
Yeah. So in Veritatis Splendor, John Paul II talks about the problem in today's society that we think, freedom is just like do whatever you want with your body, with your mind, etc. And he says that this stems from the fact that we've lost the connection in our philosophy of being and truth to freedom. So initially with the scholastics, they thought that freedom was, I'm going to recognize all of being. I'm going to know as much as I possibly can. My will is going to be ordered to what it should be ordered to, etc. And then Ockham kind of turned it on its head, as well as some other people, by saying that freedom is actually the ability to either acknowledge reality or to put up these walls that I was talking about with Casey. John Paul II talks a lot more about the effects of this kind of thought. And then he also talks about the conscience, which, I think that's especially important because with Aquinas, the conscience is something that is able to be formed. And you can say, okay, well, it's wrong to ignore my conscience, but I'm going to follow it and then like try to cultivate it as I go. Whereas for Ockham, he would just say, or at least in John Paul II's interpretation of it, he would say like, well, your conscience is something that kind of limits you. So you should follow it, but it'll make you less free.
Okay, we're at time. Let's thank our